Good evening and welcome to the 64th annual Leo Baeck Memorial Lecture. My name is Markus Krah. I'm the Executive Director of the Leo Baeck Institute, and I'm very happy to welcome you all who have come here in person and to welcome the many other people who are watching this event via the live stream. The Leo Baeck Memorial Lecture has been endowed by Marianne C. Dreyfus and family, who are descendants of Rabbi Leo Baeck, and I assume that a few members of the family are in attendance, if only on the live stream, so thank you for your generosity for making this possible. The Leo Baeck Lecture is delivered each year by an outstanding, renowned scholar or public intellectual in the field of German Jewish history and culture. This year, you will hear from Atina Grossmann, professor at the Cooper Union. And the Leo Baeck Memorial Lecture is really at the center of what we try to do at the Leo Baeck Institute, or institutes, I should say, in the context of our three institutes in New York, in London, and in Jerusalem, and as part of the Center for Jewish History, where we find ourselves tonight. We try to preserve and promote the history and culture of German-speaking Jewries. We do that by lectures like tonight, by panel discussions, by exhibits, and our latest adventure in this is the podcast, of which I hope you have heard, Exile. I would encourage you to check it out. It is a wonderful way to get these stories of people who experienced exile straight into your ears, and I can tell you, they touch me at least, not just at the head, but also at the heart and the guts. I am very happy that we have such a wonderful speaker today. I will in a moment ask Marcia Rosenblick, the chair of our Academic Advisory Board, to introduce Atina properly. Just to give you the run of show, after Atina's lecture, I have the honor on behalf of LBI President David Marble, who sends his regards, to present Atina with the Moses Mendelssohn Award for her achievements in the field of German Jewish history. And this will be followed by a reception in the Great Hall outside the auditorium, which will also be an opportunity for you to talk and continue the conversation with Atina. We thought it might be nicer to do this in a more personal way than in the very in the traditional Q&A format, which sometimes is not the best way to talk and exchange personal stories. Again, welcome to you all. Thank you, Atina, and thank you, Marcia, for introducing our speaker today.
Thank you very much. It's my enormous pleasure to introduce our speaker for the 64th Annual Leo Baeck Memorial Lecture. I have known Atina Grossmann for about 50 years. She may not remember that, but I have. We were students together in a graduate seminar. She's nodding, so she remembers. In a graduate seminar in history in European social history with David Crew, now retired from Texas, I think. This was at Columbia in the spring of 2025, maybe? 2024? I don't remember exactly. I'm sorry, that's ridiculous. 1975, 50 years ago. Okay, I'm getting old. Anyway, from the beginning of my acquaintance with her, I was impressed with her incisive and analytical mind, her profound knowledge of European and especially German history, her wit, her sarcasm, and her lively and engaging persona. I have, of course, known her ever since. I meet her at conferences, workshops, committees, and so we have become friends as well. She's the perfect person, I think, to give this Leo Baeck Institute Memorial Lecture. She's the child of Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany. She's American-born and trained. I think she's American-born. You are, right? I didn't ask her. She's a great scholar of Germany and especially of Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany. She's in fact a consummate scholar. She began her scholarly career as a German social historian, especially in the very new field of women's history, and she quickly became one of its international leaders. Her dissertation and her first book was on birth control and abortion in Weimar Germany, Nazi Germany, and post-war Germany. And the book, which resulted, is entitled Reforming Sex, the German Movement for Birth Control and Abortion, 1920 to 1950, published by Oxford in 1995. And it marked her as a brilliant historian of women in 20th century Germany across different political regimes. Even earlier than that book, she co-edited one of the most important books in women's history in Nazi Germany, When Biology Became Destiny, Women in Weimar and Nazi Germany, which came out in 1984. So Atina Grossmann then gained fame initially as a German women's historian, but she quickly turned her attention to Jews, especially those who fled Nazi Germany, but also not just German Jews, also Eastern European Jews who survived the Holocaust. Her magnum opus, her magnum opus is a book that appeared in 2009 entitled Jews, Germans, and Allies, Close Encounters in Occupied Germany, which is really a tour de force of historical scholarship. It looks at Jewish survivors, mostly in the displaced persons camps in the American zone of Germany, and their interactions with each other, with other Germans, and with the American, and also to some extent with the British and Russian occupiers of Germany. She displayed their enormous sensitivity and a true understanding of the plight of those survivors. I was really overwhelmed by it when I read it. It won, of course, prestigious prizes, including the George L. Mossy Prize from the American Historical Association and the Frankel Prize of the Wiener Library in London. She edited many other books on related themes. In German, Wege in der Fremde, deutsch-jüdische Begegnungsgeschichte zwischen Feldafing, New York, I'm going to say that in English, and Tehran, in 2012, a book that dealt with Germans and Jews, obviously. Feldafing is, of course, a DP camp, right? And then she published another co-edited book, is a bilingual book called Our Courage, Unser Mut, Jews in Europe, 1945 to 1948, which is technically the exhibit catalog for an exhibit at the Jewish Museum in Frankfurt, which was exhibited in 2021. The book came out before that in 2020. Still in several other books, Crimes of War, Guilt and Denial in the 20th Century, Shelter from the Holocaust, Rethinking Jewish Survival in the Soviet Union, which came out in 2017. And of course, she wrote lots of articles, and received many fellowships. As Marcus Krah said, she's a professor of history at Cooper Union. She's on lots of editorial boards, including the American Historical Review and also Holocaust and Genocide Studies. She's on many scholarly boards, including at the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York, and also she was on the Academic Advisory Board of the Leo Baeck Institute. And she just stepped down, maybe a year ago, after many years of loyal and very significant service on that board. Her current project is on Jewish refugees from Nazi Europe who went to not America or Great Britain or Palestine. They went to Iran and India and Central Asia. It's a sprawling multinational study, which I am sure will be fabulous. Tonight, her lecture comes out of that research. She's entitled it, as you can see, Trauma, Privilege, and Adventure, Jewish Refugees Between Orient and European Catastrophe. I am looking forward, as I'm sure all of you are, to a brilliant and interesting lecture by my friend, Professor Atina Grossmann.
Wow, Marcia, that was quite an introduction. I could tell stories about that seminar we were both in, but I won't. At least not up here, maybe later. Yes, well, first of all, thank you, Marcia. And thank you very much to the Leo Baeck Institute, the Board of Trustees, and the Academic Advisory Council, which, as Marcia said, I had to leave in order to be able to do this lecture. No, I had to leave anyway, for approving and awarding this honor, and to Marcus Kra and David Brown for their forbearance with the organization and also COVID-related rescheduling. As I think some of you, probably many of you know, this honor is especially meaningful for me because the LBI has been part of my life for a very long time, even longer than I've known Marcia. I am a product of Yekka refugee life on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. I went to Hebrew school at Congregation Habonim with Rabbi Hahn. I even went to a couple youth group dances with the Fons, whose mother was the head of the sisterhood. And very importantly, while a student at then nearby Hunter College High School, my after-school job was at the LBI, shelving books and papers. And among my many contributions to the Institute, also cataloging, very carefully, the collected papers of the philosopher Fritz Mautner, about whom I knew exactly nothing, which just goes to show you how far the Leo Baeck Institute and its professionalization has come in the last 70 years. So, on that note of gratitude and memory, this is a talk that I have been living with, working with already for much too long in many ways. It's about refugee time in between Orient and European catastrophe, particularly in non-Western locales, a time that is often effaced or marginalized, perceived perhaps as exotic, but mainly as frustrating, difficult interruptions of passage to new homes in what is seen as more desirable places that remain closed or excruciatingly hard to reach for Jews trying to flee the Nazis in the world of 1938, just as a backdrop. So much of my work in the past years has focused on trying to understand the meaning of these transnational journeys in both history and memory, and how they can be, and increasingly are, this is a growing field, integrated into German Jewish history and more generally Holocaust studies. So this evening I want to think with you about questions about how to do that integration in relation to my own research on mostly Central European refugees in Iran and India, including, as you will see and hear, you already saw on the first slide, my own family history. An archive of materials much too large, much too disorganized, that, as I've often remarked, I would have been absolutely thrilled to discover in the collections of the Leo Baeck Institute, but that instead tumbled out of the closets of my childhood apartment on West 78th Street, and that will, once I've worked my way through it, indeed, I promise, take its place at the LBI. There are many, many other sources that I have used, and I want to particularly acknowledge here the support of the Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, where I was lucky enough to be the Ina Levine Invitational Scholar last year, which gave me some very precious time and access to resources. But in so many places. The World Jewish Congress records for Asia, UNRWA reports on Iran, documentary films from the Polish Army in exile shot in Iran, the archives of the Joint Distribution Committee, the India office of the British Library still has a whiff of empire, and the ever-expanding body of new comparative work on global transit. And last but not least, the dauntingly extensive set of letters and memorabilia from my own parents' experience. All of these sources speak to what we have come to call a colonial or imperial turn in Holocaust and German Jewish refugee studies. That is, a focus on the entangled problems of race, class, and gender, and the different registers of racism in the encounter between desperate European Jewish refugees and colonial or quasi-colonial subjects, as well as colonial authorities, in mostly, not always, temporary flight destinations. This is, as I noted, an emerging field, but growing. Globalizing the Holocaust, decolonizing it, decentering, investigating global transit across this, almost the entirety of this globe, in order to recenter it, figure out how it fits into the narrative of German Jewish and Holocaust history and memory, in scholarship, but also in public culture, such as films, museums, journalism. What is it really that we signal when we use this term, which denotes such very varied experiences? Certainly varied in terms of duration. Different temporalities clearly matter. They could stretch from very short stopovers to periods of months and years, often over a decade, sometimes for decades, or even a lifetime. Location certainly mattered, whether one landed in a colony, as in India, East Africa, or the Caribbean, a quasi-independent and later occupied monarchy, like Iran, relatively autonomous parts of the British Empire, like South Africa or Australia. It mattered if one landed in sovereign non-European states, as in Latin America. There's a lot of wonderful work on Latin America. Or in a European port, for example, Lisbon, temporarily safe from the Nazis, but anxiously seeking an exit from the continent and the constant threat of Nazi invasion. Or in the international city of Shanghai, and then in a quasi-ghetto under Japanese occupation. Or, of course, in the territory, Marcia already mentioned that I've worked on this, where the great majority of Polish Jews who survived endured the war, the Soviet Union, after 1941, mostly in also quasi-colonial Central Asia, part of the Soviet Empire. And of course, numbers mattered, whether in the hundreds, like in Tehran, in the thousands in India, or the several hundred thousands in the Soviet Union. Trajectories differed according to place of origin, profession or occupation, gender, family configuration, definitely age. Children and youth had very distinct and often happier experiences than their elders. Moreover, and we tend to overlook this when examining the fate of European Jewry, the presence or not of significant local Jewish communities and the degree of interaction between especially Mizrahi and Ashkenazi Jews. This is especially relevant for my story, particularly for South or East Asia, the role of Baghdadi Jews, the Anglo-Asian global Jewish elite that occupied, certainly in India, in other ways also in Iran, another kind of in-between position, navigating among British colonial officials and settlers, colonized Indians, and including the indigenous Jewish B'nai Israel community and European refugees. So there are many, many variables to this global transit story. In all cases, as we shall see, the fate of European Jewish refugees certainly in Iran and India, cannot be separated from the backdrop of empire, nationalism, and anti-British colonialism on the one hand, and the encroaching war and genocide on the other. And I think just if you just look at this for a moment, you even see some of the differences between 1930 and 1944. So I want to just start the real text with two quotes. One comes from an 8-page, single-spaced, typed Bericht, dated Tehran, a report, December 1st, 1936, mailed in multiple copies to friends and family, those left behind mostly, here they are, gathered in a new post-1933 Central European diaspora, connected precariously but insistently by letters, postcards, telegrams, circulating from Tehran, Bombay, after 1939, internment camps in British India and throughout the empire, to London, to Palestine, to Cape Town, to Buenos Aires, to California, New York, and back to the family and friends who remained trapped in Berlin. And here, if you look at this photo of those left behind, I'm sure that none of you will be surprised to know, I'm getting an echo, that the younger generation depicted here. Is there a problem with the sound? Just keep going? Okay, we'll ignore the problem. At least this one, good. That the elder groups at this Kaffee und Kuchen birthday celebration shortly before Kristallnacht in 1938 in Berlin did not survive, and the younger people all did survive, although one person to whom I will return just very barely. A carbon copy of this Bericht, preserved by its author, arrived with him in New York City 10 years later, in September 1946. I unearthed it in an Upper West Side closet almost half a century later and only read it while on research leave at the Holocaust Museum last year. The text was written by one among many of my primary, in both senses of the term, sources, my father, who is the second from the left there, a 34-year-old, disbarred, communist fellow traveler, Jewish lawyer from Berlin, who had arrived in Tehran a year earlier. He begins by noting that he writes mainly about what seems unfamiliar, exotic, we might say, to a European. Therefore, he cautions the reader might easily come to the wrong conclusion, as if I was sitting here in the middle of the Orient and everything was totally different than bei uns. This is, he says, to a relatively large extent true, zu einem recht großen Teil zutreffend, but not, he insists, as much as his readers might imagine when they saw the postmark. He is fascinated, bemused, bewildered, situated between roles and identities, a delighted tourist, dispatching travelogues back to Europe, an uprooted immigrant trying to put together a living in a new home, and a refugee, anxious about his own uncertain fate and that of the family left behind. But certainly, when it came to places like Iran and India, with their long histories of political, trade, economic, and cultural ties to Germany, he and his fellow refugees did not land in entirely unknown and alien places. Their destinations were not blank slates. These documents did not come by accident. Refugees relied on colleagues from the region, as well as on existing international business, professional, and personal connections that could facilitate and encourage with an offer of employment or a letter of introduction, urgent flight to places that might not have been a first choice. Persian and Indian students, especially in medicine, dentistry, engineering, or business partners, whether rug dealers or contractors for railroad or road construction, were very visible in Paris, London, and Berlin. Their presence a key feature of interwar imperial cosmopolitanism, cemented in some cases by marriage and romance, or in rarer cases, even conversion to Islam or Hinduism. Moreover, it's really important, I think, to keep this in mind, the cultural imaginary circulated particularly by Weimar mass media in illustrated magazines, travel memoirs, photographs, films, novels, offered a rich array of images of the world beyond Europe, both enticing and frightening. Shanghai was frightening, which accompanied refugees on their journeys. After 1933, bulletins published by the Hilfsverein der Deutschen Juden, you find it in the LBI archives or library, offered detailed reports based on reports from those refugees who had already traveled and from established communities about all of these possible sites in the global South. South America, Southern and East Asia, South Asia, Southern and East Africa, South Asia, and other parts of the British Empire, including, of course, Palestine. These pre-existing links are omnipresent once one starts to look. Traditions of German and German Jewish Orientalist scholarship, in the touristic gaze of the feuilleton, in the urban streetscape, in Berlin, the Hindustan Cafe, in the heart of commercial Jewish asphalt culture, on the corner of Kudamm and Tauentzienstraße, was a hub for radical students, Asian and German young communists. Persian students published radical anti-Shah newsletters, and the radical chic scene in Berlin-Charlottenburg could gather in the mosque led by Hugo Marcus, a Jewish convert, and hear lectures by people like sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld. Language tutoring and other local knowledge provided by students prepared refugees for emigration. That's how my mother learned her basic Farsi. With this as background to his quite involuntary and somewhat accidental journey to Tehran, my father therefore embarked on an amateur reportage career while settling into the rapidly changing city, cobbling together a living as a legal advisor. He was, after all, ein deutscher Rechtsanwalt, even if thrown down the stairs of the courthouse, and an import-export trader in the bazaar. Endangered as a leftist and physically expelled as a non-Aryan from the Berlin courthouse in which he had been so proud to appear as a young, brash attorney, Hasigro, as he had Dada-like abbreviated his Germanic name, Hans Sigismund Grossmann, needed to get out of the new Nazi Germany fast, and just happened to have an Armenian girlfriend. She was in that family scene, actually. With family in Tehran willing to welcome him, a refugee, traveler, migrant, all overlapping identities in the 1930s. And that connection between a Berlin Jew and an Armenian woman from Tehran, itself an example of the transnational movement between Germany and Iran, as is the motorcycle in this newsletter from the German-Persian Chamber of Commerce. The motorcycle plays an important story an important role in these stories. He writes his Berichte, this feuilleton Tehran, in the self-ironizing Berliner Schnauze style of a Weimar rasende reporter. He types, literally hundreds of densely detailed descriptions of Iran in the 30s as it underwent the rapid authoritarian modernization, or as he phrased it in the language of the German left, state monopoly capitalism imposed by Reza Shah Pahlavi, streets were dug up to install 6,000 eagerly awaited telephone connections, die Segnungen der Kultur, as he called it, and sewage systems to replace the rivulets on the side of streets, used for both waste and washing and even drinking by the poor, were built. Europeans, on the other hand, mistrusting even the city fountains, trekked to the only two truly trustworthy sources of drinking water, at the Shah's Palace or the British Embassy. Hence the monikers Englisches Wasser and Shahwasser. The Trans-Iranian Railroad inched its way from the Caspian to within 1 kilometer of Tehran, where a German company was constructing a much too large train station. It later becomes very useful in wartime. New roads cut into the maze of the old bazaar with its Babel, Sprachgewimmel, of cultures and languages, Jews, Turks, Arabs, Indians, Armenians, Syrians, Assyrians, Copts, Chaldeans. This new Tehran, with a few multi-story buildings, opera, the central post office, whose boîte postale would become such a crucial lifeline of connection and information, the Café Pars, where one danced with vodka and caviar into the early hours, sprung up around Avenue Ferdowsi, frequented by middle-class Iranians and the relatively small number of Central European Jews. As I said, really probably only in the hundreds. As the report, the Bericht said, die Radfahrerkolonie. And those of you who know the old German Jewish joke about die Juden und die Radfahrer will know what this is a reference to. Otherwise, we'll talk about it later. A word about his observations on gender. He's, as a true Weimar man, he is keenly attuned to gender conventions, tries to figure out social norms and how they might apply to him. And here you see my mother in the bazaar. That is her notebook with an image of the Crown Prince, will later become the Shah. And you see the letterhead from the Palace of Justice, where she is working as a secretary. He observes, for example, how the Shah's unpopular 1936 imposition of a ban on the veil has led to policemen prowling the streets, ripping tightly tied headscarves off the heads of women who still ventured out onto the streets. Ironically, now more restricted in their access to public space than before the secularizing reform. Obviously, an ironic observation today. At the same time, he marvels at Oriental customs. Persian merchants, he claims, are not, as his readers might assume, crooks and cheats out to trick foreigners, but simply good businessmen, with whom he is now partnering in the bazaar. He orients himself, on the other hand, by frequent recourse to European images he carries with him in his head. The mountains surrounding Tehran remind him of the Alps. The Russian or European trained physicians in Tehran are every bit as skilled as the ones he might have relied upon in Berlin, although there, in the absence of the many Oriental maladies that beset Europeans, he had less need of them. Farsi was just like Hebrew in that one really needed to know the language in order to read the script, and hence working on learning to read and write. He spins tales of adventures in so many of these letters and reports at multi-religious festivals, parties, cabarets, swimming in the Caspian, skiing in the mountains surrounding Tehran, and riding that motorcycle. His new girlfriend, my mother, in the sidecar through the desert. And here I always, sort of joke that if one were to write a book about yekas, this would be the perfect image. Why he is letting himself be photographed in the middle of the desert with a jacket and tie, you can explain to me. And my mother is a very different sort, who is much more at ease in the Orient, on her donkey. He unravels the mysteries of the city, in which the majority of streets are unpaved. Even the rich live in these narrow streets, hidden behind gardens and decaying walls, and wealth is not demonstrably visible. He is relieved that, unlike many of his compatriots, he's arrived in time to decipher Tehran's topography and learn basic Farsi before the Shah's nationalist initiatives lead in 1936 to the removal of all non-Farsi script from public signage. This move left Europeans and the refugees who had mistakenly expected a modernization program more along the lines of the Turkish reforms to go exactly in the opposite direction, toward greater use of Latin lettering, and when that didn't happen, it left them often literally lost. For the most part, then, stranded in precarious safety on the margins of their collapsing and ever more devastated Jewish European world, refugees lived as hybrids, themselves on the margins. Expelled and in flight from homelands that had them condemned as racially inferior, they now encountered and benefited from a different form, quite different form, of racialized colonial hierarchy and fraught white skin privilege, as you see here. In the mountains above Tehran, on a skiing holiday in Derbent resort above Tehran, with its clearly racialized colonial imagery. And you see them and their friends surrounded by local bearers, servants, quintessential image of European privilege, recalling in some ways alpine vacations, in other ways colonial mores. The European Jewish refugees occupied then this peculiar, ambivalent, in-between position. And here you see it literally, perhaps, in these postal connections. On the one side, there is the typed report about the trip from Tehran to the old Orient, or from Persia to Iran, from Iran to Persia. On the other side, a letter from Berlin to Tehran, September 20th, 1940. Asking for food packages and reporting on a move to a Judenhaus that has made life easier because now there are not so many rooms to clean and stairs to climb. Many of you will be familiar with those coded letters. So they partake of this privilege and adventure, but they are not part of a colonial or occupier elite, and always shadowed by this emerging catastrophe, as it is expressed in this letter from September 1940. Displaced, uprooted, anxiously uncertain about their futures, and ceaselessly worried about those left behind, carrying that trauma. Strikingly, at a time in 1940-41 when Iran was plagued by food shortages and high inflation, European Jews were nonetheless sending packages of beans, sugar, lard, and other foodstuff from Tehran to Jew houses, Judenhäuser, in Berlin to support their families. Moreover, as Hazigro reflects in his Berichte, in this journey from Tehran to the Orient, with both the cultural condescension of someone encountering a less advanced civilization, but also, I think, with genuine appreciation. Quote, there is a warmth here, a lack of the distance, Fremdheit, among people, which reconciles one to much that is strange and difficult. So I would suggest here that we find, and multiple other accounts, I have many more, something more complicated and multi-layered than what is often now being called a complicit European colonizing gaze. Productively pressured by younger historians, I could just name Kimberly Cheng, Pragya Kaul, Ryan Sutton. There is a long list. There will be many footnotes in the published version of this paper, with a language and cultural fluency that Europeanists like myself approaching the subject lack. historians of Jewish refugees in the global South are now rather belatedly and necessarily thinking with a post-colonial critical lens. It is, I think, indispensable, that approach. However, the position of a Weimar cosmopolitan entering another not entirely unfamiliar cosmopolitan space, from Berlin to Tehran or Bombay, who sees also through the lens not only of colonialism, but of photojournalism, the feuilleton, and already has some knowledge of the local language and history, acquired, for example, through lessons with students involved in a common international communist movement. That lens also matters. The onset of war and the arrival of Allied troops in Iran and intensified British and American military presence and production in India generates eventually an even more multinational and multicultural society. Some of you will know about the arrival of the Anders Army from the Soviet Union, the Polish Army in exile, the Tehran children from Uzbekistan on their way to Palestine, and of course, the extreme importance of Iran as the probably most important non-combat theater of war during the Second World War here, the famous Tehran Conference. In contrast, a second excerpt. Let's consider one from a rather lengthy audio interview that I found in the USHMM archives, conducted in Sydney on May 8, 1984. Harold G. Jensen recounts his passage from youth in Eastern Germany, now Poland, to an apprenticeship designed to prepare him for emigration in Hamburg, and his family's flight to Bombay. Where is she? Where did he go? There he is. With the help of a distant relative who had already settled in Bombay as an ear, nose, and throat specialist in 1934, the 18-year-old arrived in February 1939 with his parents and no formal education. His cardiologist father found a position in the provinces, and relatives quickly arranged employment for the teenager in the spinning and weaving mills owned by Sir Victor Sassoon, the playboy scion and a critical player in refugee aid in both Bombay and Shanghai of the Baghdadi Jewish dynasty that had hooked its fortunes to the by then very beleaguered British Empire, facing world war and working-class anti-colonial labor agitation. The David Sassoon Mills were among Bombay's largest employers. They hired B'nai Israel Jews, and skirting the law, also Jewish enemy aliens, like Hans, his then name. In a fascinating account of these precarious but also tangible benefits of white skin privilege, the young refugee, now Harold, remembered that he was paid like an Indian, 50 rupees a month, but I was a European, earning as little as they did, lived in same bungalow, and yet they knew I was a European, and that caused me problems. His Indian co-workers were angry, he said, that he enjoyed entry to places open only to Europeans. He could swim at the beach in the affluent district of Breach Candy on his days off. He was again painfully in between, not popular with his co-workers, who were suspicious of this apparent intruder at their workplace, while the mill manager of the Sassoon Mills would not deign to talk to him because he worked with Indians. Recounting that story years later, he still describes that difficulty and the shock of being carried off for internment as an enemy alien, a fate from which the Sassoons could not rescue him. And yet, in another example of enduring privilege, he stresses that the connections he forged with Indian colleagues while climbing up the management ladder, eventually even into a commission for the Indian Army, proved extraordinarily valuable. For a prosperous life, he was eventually able to establish for himself and his family as a jute and flax merchant in Australia. So global transit would have many afterlives. In another interview, Louis Jortner, he's hanging out back there, a child refugee, was 9 when he arrived, described this comfortable life in Bombay. He was hyper-aware, quote, of being white and having money in a very poor country. Our acquaintances were Europeans, yet some of his classmates in his elite British school were Indian, also elite. He recalled a memorable conversation with a Hindu boy who suddenly announced with passionate conviction, "Independence is coming, we're going to be free of the British." And he recalled, "I remember being intimidated." Everyday life for these German, Austrian, Jewish refugees, their numbers again are very unclear, anywhere between 2,000 and 6,000, was replete with such contradictions. They were European, but not British. Starting in fall of '39, enemy aliens scrambling to stay afloat, safe but certainly not secure, often behind the barbed wire of internment camps from which they had to move from these comfortable Bombay apartments, and consumed with anxiety for those who had been left behind. Women, to speak about gender for a moment, you can see the women around the table. Married women in India sometimes took on, or at least performed, the roles of British colonial matrons, especially if their husbands had acquired positions as physicians, engineers, plant managers, assuming with a certain alacrity management of households with numerous servants and garden parties, entertaining allied soldiers, local officials, neighbors, while also clinging to refugee social circles and sometimes here religious observance, bar mitzvah. They strove to uphold these colonial mores, which were quite unfamiliar to them, while navigating the climate, its associated maladies, their children's education, often in boarding schools, in far away and cooler hill stations, where they would be separated for months at a time, collected gossip, kept track of illicit affairs, nervous and physical breakdowns, tried their hand at matchmaking, and in India certainly packed for and tried to maintain the family during internment. And the Herman Zeltzer papers at the LBI give a lot of insight into that process. Young single women, on the other hand, like my mother, inhabited different positions, often suspect as women of loose morals, vulnerable to a putative white slave trade, which made it more difficult for them to acquire entry visas. And like married women, they were restricted in practicing professions such as medicine. But women did work, often multiple jobs, as housekeepers or managers in the many bed and breakfast boarding houses. For all I know, this could have been one, offering a semblance of Central European home and cooking. As secretaries in refugee organizations, bookkeepers for multinational firms, music tutors. Berta Hellinger's story can stand in for many. A young widow from Vienna, she came to Calcutta, sponsored by a relative's British neighbor, initially worked as a domestic, as German Jewish women did in the UK. And then she opened a boarding house in a hill station. Her daughter, like many middle-class European and Indian girls, was sent to a Loretta convent boarding school. After graduating from secretarial school, she worked for a British company in Delhi and Bombay. Berta's son, on the other hand, apprenticed to a Baghdadi Jewish photographer. And there's a great deal to be said about the importance of the Baghdadi Jewish community and their assistance for Jewish refugees who soon became prominent in Bombay and Calcutta's vibrant cultural life: music, architecture, education, physicians, architects, teachers. And now, in order for me to make this point, consider these photos of Kurt Goldstein's villa in Madras in a photo album preserved in the Holocaust Museum archives, luckily not yet digitized. A chemist, he had arrived from Breslau shortly after Kristallnacht, the beneficiary of business and professional connections, and was living in a rather luxurious colonial-style home with a veranda an inflatable swimming pool. And we find this identity card on the website, apparently securing him a place in India. But once we juxtapose the photo and its brief caption with a larger collection, we see that he's gotten help from the Jewish Relief Association. We see that he has the certificate of identity. With a larger collection of information, a quite different picture emerges, which challenges or at least relativizes the paradigm of colonial white skin privilege. The available evidence can trick us. Goldstein and his family only enjoyed that villa for about a year. His and other Jewish refugees' situation was radically different from that of Britishers or non-Axis refugees. Already by fall '39, he had been exiled from Madras, that nice house, to a British internment camp. And that identity card that at first looked so reassuring was in fact just a stopgap document valid for a single journey to the US by a stateless person in lieu of a valid passport. And detained with his wife and young son in a parole center in Yercaud in central India, he wages that all too familiar paper war for escape, albeit under the frustrating conditions of Allied internment rather than imminent threat by the Nazis. It starts October 2nd, 1940. There's a letter from the American consulate in Madras requesting his presence at the consulate. But Goldstein responds from Lakeview Cottage, sounds much nicer than it was, in Parole Center, Yercaud, on October 5th, asking for further details so he could apply for permission to leave the camp and to prove the urgency of my journey to the British commander. We can read the urgency and frustration in these polite exchanges to the government of India, to the district magistrate of Madras, to the commander of the internment camp, to the American consulate in Madras, the American consulate in Berlin. All paperwork had to go through Berlin. Thomas Cook shipping agents, shipping lines, medical certificates. The Americans wanted to make sure that there were no loathsome diseases. Quota numbers only had limited validity. Time runs out. He has to start over. Everything via cable. Own expense, while interned without any income. Here on January 4th, 41, they are still trapped. Finally, April 26th, 41, under the wire before the U.S. enters the war and trans-ocean routes are shut down. 3 second-class berths on SS President Grant, Voyage 55, sailing from Bombay, via Cape Town. The Goldsteins are lucky. Kurt has a brother in Lakewood, New Jersey, who can supply affidavits and wire money, funds for tickets, and fees. This official correspondence supplements the personal letters we have been looking at. So missives from loved ones in Nazi Germany arrive in Tehran, in Bombay, Calcutta, in the internment camps and parole centers for enemy aliens and suspect enemy agents. And you can see here some of the lists, and there my father actually manages to get himself categorized as a suspected enemy agent because of his work in the bazaar, that import-export traditional Jewish trade. But in these internment camps, ironically, internees are classified as POWs, and they have access to mail and Red Cross postcards, which reveal details about Jewish everyday life in Nazi Germany. That proverbial stoic, brave face, you saw the letter from September 40, vying with hints about the gravity of what is going on, gratitude for any news, and especially for those food packages. And there, too, we find that paper war, telegrams, fees for telegrams, pleas for affidavits, navigating visas and exit permits that expire just when the shipping passage is secured, the berth that is no longer available, when a quota number is secured. The coded letters, the mutual misunderstandings, and always the longing for reunions, the dawning realization that they would never happen. But there are also hints of desperate struggles for survival in the belly of the monster. So there is a letter to my father in internment and parole camp Puranda on July 24, 1943, from his Aryan sister-in-law in Frankfurt, with an urgent rescue, hiding, and eventual capture hinted at in a scribbled Gefangenenpost, these Red Cross missives that went to the internment camp from the sister-in-law, saying, Mutter schreibt auch nicht, lebt aber, wie ich hörte, hier in der Mark. This was the mother and an aunt who had been hidden in Schöneberg and then hidden again in Lüschen in Brandenburg until they were captured. Even that news trickled into an internment camp in India. This transnational circulation of information and emotion offers a comparative lens on Jewish life and death under Nazism. In new homes, including Palestine or in Latin America, and in global transit, within this Orient, striving towards independence, engaged in nation building and anti-colonial struggle, and also enmeshed in global politics and war. And here are some of the letters from Bombay, again, from my father to my mother in Tehran. Pursuing her own adventures, Erica writes to Hazigro in Purandar, British India, on September 30th, 1944, responding to his bitterness about being stuck in British internment rather than being able to join the fight against the German enemy. Quote, "It gives me a sick feeling imagining you talking about the missed opportunities for offering revenge for the suffering of our Jewish brethren. We, the spared ones, trying to combat despair. It brings in me something very similar to hatred, and then I feel something nearing despair. The scars remain, as does the ambivalence about leaving." He's really trying very hard to convince her to join him in this attempted move to the United States. She is very reluctant. Finally released, Hazigro writes from Bombay to Tehran in late 45. "You would be fascinated by Bombay's cosmopolitan life. The variety of races, colors, dresses, the hyper-modern city. But of course, there is also indescribable poverty and dirt, and tellingly, practically no contact between Indians and Europeans, no mutual knowledge and love, and neither is there, as will become very clear in only a short period, between Hindus and Muslims." And as he, by now in his early 40s, had already written while contemplating starting over again in North America, "Certainty in every respect has left me more than 12 years ago. I don't know whether it will ever return, and whether it is even an aim to be desired and to be strongly longed for." There's more to say about these letters. Okay. And finally, then, we come to the post-war departures. Here you see menu from the SS Aquitania, February 1947, with typically horrendous English food, and a photo. I don't know whether you have the same association with a particular movie that I do when I look at this image, but most people do. This depicts Erica's reluctant departure from Tehran on a snowy December 2nd, 1946, with a man hovering behind her, both of them in suspended motion, as if paralyzed. And yet she gets on that airplane, on her way to the US via Palestine, where she will reunite with surviving family, and London, where she will also reconnect, before moving on to reunite with a fiancé, Hazigro, she had not seen since their parting in Tehran in May 1941 and his incarceration and entrapment in British India. There is much here that I don't know and can only intuit, The gaps in this photo representative of so many silences in letters and oral accounts, the personal relationships forged, the love affairs, the lure of staying versus the pull of obligation and family back to the West. That is a connection that does endure. It's another lecture. The key point remains that whatever the degree of attachment to their transit refuges, and sometimes even to people who one loved deeply, the vast majority of Jews left after the war. Once the colonial European Jews, once the colonial or occupation authorities who had presided over the cosmopolitan cities that had made this refugee life possible departed, and certainly when revolution, nationalism, or the violence of partition in British India threatened more violence. In other words, these uprooted, stateless, and precariously privileged German-speaking Jewish refugees existed in multiple entangled worlds at the same time. These worlds congealed in these strange homemade badges, eerily similar to cassette markings, with the reminders of a lost past, the reference to a doctor of laws, and the presence of POW status in British, not German camps. He lists them all. The jail in Kveta, where he was first held, Deolali, Dehradun, Puranda. The day-to-day life in wherever they ended up, managing the unfamiliar and alien as well as alluring and fascinating, gender and generation specific, intersecting with transit sites, visions, uncertain visions of the future, and always also the homes and loved ones they left behind, carried by the continued traffic of letters, postcards, and telegrams. These are homemade badges. I don't know when they were made. They traveled from Bombay to New York. The European catastrophe, as in these badges, loomed large, transmitted by BBC broadcasts, reports by Allied soldiers who had served in Europe. And after the war was over, came the confirmation that so many, most, they had left behind were lost, murdered, the news trickling in via survivor lists published in that transnational Lifeline weekly Aufbau, and often via form letters, not always accurate, from the Red Cross, what we now know as the ITS, the International Tracing Service, which refugees across the globe, from South Africa to Rhodesia to Shanghai to Bombay to Tehran, contacted, as did Hazigro, via the Jewish Relief Association in Bombay, where he had secured employment. On August 9, 1946, he wrote, still from Bombay to Tehran, as Muslim-Hindu violence loomed, with an awareness of what it meant to speak of having lived through a truly world and not just European or Pacific conflict. World War II is not yet over. He has received news from his older brother, he was also in the photo, who had escaped to Hartford, Connecticut in 1939. He had just spent $200 for 50 packages for Mr. Busse, Erica's father, who had emerged from hiding in Berlin, and also for Wally, the faithful Paula, the family housekeeper, released from Ravensbrück concentration camp, where she had been consigned for participating and abetting the failed rescue of her employer, their mother and aunt, who had, as the letter says, been hidden first with an Aryan family somewhere in Schöneberg, then in Mecklenburg. But in a story, again for another lecture, so they were arrested and have disappeared since, and remain disappeared. So many letters landed in Bombay and Tehran, describing the long nights of the Blitz in London. I still sleep with clenched fists, a friend writes. Her sister is in Addis Ababa, another with the British Army in Cairo. Another friend has tales to tell about his service across North Africa in the French Foreign Legion, all mixed in with very terse descriptions of survival in Auschwitz, Monowitz, the death march to Mauthausen, finally liberation. This German Jewish diaspora remained connected to those who had been left behind, as well as the deep impression of the in-between. So, finally, what remains? What did they carry? Historians often say about the remnants of material culture. Here are two items that I think are so evocative that Hazigo carried with him on the SS General Gordon from Bombay to San Francisco in the fall of '46 and then to New York. They speak, I think, to the entangled and hybrid multi-level experience. The Gebetbuch for Shabbos services, put together by Rabbi Joachim Prinz, der Freitagabend, given to him by his mother as a farewell gift when he left Berlin for Tehran in 1936, and carried with him through the years in Tehran, and one of the very few items duly stamped by the censor that the British allowed him to keep when they arrested him at the border in Quetta. And at the same time, the beautifully written Quran that my mother carried with her to New York when she finally arrived in early 1947, both of them having pride of place in the refugee memory package. Material objects. These are the material objects of refugee life in the Orient. The Persian miniatures, the rugs, hand-tailored elegant dresses, the Quran, but there was also caviar and vodka from Nowruz feasts in New York City. These artifacts in relation to mementos from home that we find in Berlin or Vienna, transported to New York or Tel Aviv or Buenos Aires, apartments haunted by photos of lost family, candlesticks, monographed linens from Europe, but also the bric-a-brac of modernist Bauhaus-style Danish modern furniture, and the inlaid tiny ivory elephants, and also a pair of British Army binoculars, which should be there, and that indispensable prisoner's item, the prisoner cup from the internment camp. So during years in the same transit location, refugees forged bonds that shaped their social circles, their networks, and their new homes. More precious often than those from the original homes, where the significant interlocutors were dead or had long since migrated onwards via other routes. So they connected the Shanghaiers, those from Tehran, those from India. They connected as subgroups. The formative experiences have become multi-directional, multi-generational. The internet has revealed Indian grand and great-grandchildren of refugee Jews, mostly women, who married into local families, only now uncovering and exploring Jewish family histories, even applying for EU passports, continuing and mapping their own global transits. So, to return to my opening question about the stakes of this research for Holocaust studies, integrating it into our narrative of German Jewish history and the Holocaust, in a world where we speak to students, colleagues, readers, audiences, who increasingly come with their own stories of displacement, migration, war, refugee life, these marginal stories become, I think, more and more central. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Atina, for a wonderful lecture that connected the very personal with the global and everything in between. Thank you for all your contributions, your scholarship, and other contributions to the Leo Baeck Institute, in recognition of which I am very glad that I can present you with the Moses Mendelssohn Award, initiated by the Academic Advisory Board and approved unanimously by the Board of Trustees of the Leo Baeck Institute. it is presented to you for your outstanding scholarship, which has advanced our understanding of German Jewish history. Congratulations and thank you.
Thank you. With my mother's Tehran jacket. It's perfect.
Thank you everybody for coming, and please join us for the reception outside this auditorium.
תודה רבה. תודה רבה. Yeah, I think that's probably, I really was not, I didn't know that I was going to get this wonderful, lovely medal. I have my dean coming to visit me in my office tomorrow. Do you think I should take it?